function. I think also again function. Function.
Okay, all right,
to get it back up to the. There we go.
Great.
Excuse me.
Can you just move it for me? Should I do it? Yeah. Okay. So there's 3 points that I want to share with you today. And one of them is that the constraints that we face in this issue of integrating the environment into humanitarian action is not necessarily a technical challenge. Second, that we need to learn to manage change. And that third, that we need to provide incentives. And I'll come back to these in a moment. But as Wendy said, I work with World Wildlife Fund. I've been with them since 2002. I'm now part of our adaptation and resilience initiative, where we're combining climate change adaptation with disaster risk reduction. And the goal of the program that I manage is what you see on the screen here, to try to provide climate-smart environmental considerations in the disaster management, broadly speaking, including recovery, reconstruction, and risk reduction. And as Wendy mentioned, we started this program that I manage now with a partnership with American Red Cross called the Green Recovery Program, and we worked together with them for 5 years in 4 countries. You can press again. Yeah, keep going. Great, thanks. Primarily in these 4 sectors: livelihood, water and sanitation, shelter, and disaster management. We did have some activities as well around health and education. Next slide, please. And so in WWF, we recognize that climate change changes everything. And we've recognized that the environment is related to humanitarian action, either natural disasters or man-made or conflict-related, and that in order to make the changes that are illuminated in the report, we need to work at multiple scales, from the international down to the individual, and from the individual up to the international. And before I go into some of the lessons that we've learned over the years, I want to just start with a very short story about something that happened to me in Sri Lanka a number of years ago that provided me with a lot of inspiration and with hope. And when we do this kind of work, it can often feel overwhelming and it can feel hopeless. And I'm trying to hang on as much as possible to the hope that we can find. And this story has to do with a community that had a pretty significant solid waste management or trash problem. And despite the best efforts of the Red Cross, of the Sri Lanka Red Cross, they just couldn't quite connect with this community about solutions to this challenge. And so they asked the WWF team to come in and take a look and see if we could come up with some solutions. Next slide. And we did, and the solution largely focused on this gentleman you see on the screen with the red circle around his head. That's Boudica. Boudica was working with our local environmental partner, EFL, at the time. And you see him there enjoying a lighter moment with a Red Cross colleague. And Boudica focused on making connections. And he had a lot of persistence, and he also had a lot of creativity. And that has stayed with me all these years, and I go back to this situation and to Boudica whenever I feel a bit stuck. And I'll explain more about what he did in a moment. But if I could go on to some other issues that we have learned that are also reflected in the report. And one, as was mentioned already by Anna and Rashid, environment is actually part of the international humanitarian architecture already. It's part of the humanitarian reform. Yes, it's a cross-cutting issue, and it suffers the joys and the sorrows of being a cross-cutting issue, but it is there. If you can hit the arrow one more time. Yeah. As Wendy mentioned, it's part of SPHERE along with DRR and climate change now in a more robust way than earlier versions. Of course, it's a key pillar of the HIOGA framework for action and is also clearly a policy goal within the Red Cross and NGO Code of Conduct. Secondly, it's never too late to increase our effectiveness. It's never too late to include the environment, as Anna mentioned. Whether you're doing assessments, whether you're starting on project design, whether you're in implementation, maybe you work on monitoring and evaluation, or you might even be the consultant that comes in at the very end to do an evaluation. Even at that point, we can make an intervention about the environment to help us move this agenda forward. Next slide. A common myth that I often hear from humanitarian professionals is looking at the environment is going to cost more and take longer. And we have examples, there are positive examples of where that is not always the case. In fact, quite often it can save you time and it can save you money. And this is an example of livelihoods in Indonesia where we were able to use spatial planning to move aquaculture livelihoods away from mangroves, which provide resilience to storm surge, which provide nursery grounds for fisheries. And there are actually better management techniques that are being developed on a daily basis. If you are starting over in an unfortunate situation, why go back to what was there before? Why not use the better practices that we have now that eliminate the need for pesticides and chemicals that lead to a better product and a better financial return for those folks? It can actually have a very clear positive benefit on bridging that relief to development continuum. This is an example from Indonesia where the Red Cross was very focused on the environmental engineering of water supply projects. That's what they do, and they do it very well. Our partnership was looking upstream and downstream at what was happening with communities and the water quality and the water quantity for that engineering. And because we had done that work and we had done that organizing, when small-scale gold mining showed up in that area and was having a negative impact on the water quality, we were able to quickly address it, move the gold mining away from the source of the water, and was making multiple benefits out of one intervention for livelihoods, for health, and for water quality. So the work that we've done, the training that we've developed, the tools that we've developed, as Wendy mentioned, we've wrapped this all up together in our Green Recovery and Reconstruction Training Toolkit, or GERT for short. It addresses the sectors you see on the screen, technical sectors, as well as how do you do design, including the environment? How do you do monitoring and evaluation and include the environment? How do you do impact assessments and include the environment is all covered in this toolkit. This is what we use in our approach. We've done it in Asia and Africa. We have a Bahasa Indonesia version of all 10 modules. We are taking one version, the DRR module, and translating that in Nepal and using Nepal-specific case studies and illustrations. We're translating half of the modules into Spanish, hopefully someday the rest into Spanish, and doing a training in August in Guatemala. And we're now using the same approach on the ground in Haiti. This is a free open source tool, and it's available online for download at the website. And the reason why WWF as an environmental organization is involved with this work is because we are trying to work with the folks represented here and others to break the disaster cycle and change the trajectory and the feedback loop from the negative to the positive by using climate-smart environmental interventions. And one of the biggest challenges that we found, and the report referenced this as well, is changing culture, changing our mindsets. Most of us who work in this field are trained in a discipline, and it's hard for us to get out of that discipline. And so we worked very hard to make those connections on the ground. And this is a photo of an American Red Cross staff and a WWF staff together going to a conference and presenting their findings. And this is, I think, the biggest barrier to making changes, systemic changes and mainstreaming changes. But who needs to change? It's not just the humanitarians, it's environmentalists as well. We need to get out of our comfort zone. We need to understand that our work on parks and protected areas and endangered species is not happening in absence of what's going on around us. And as disasters continue to grow in scale and scope, we are bumping into humanitarians and development practitioners on the ground and in the field, and it's into our best interest to learn how to work together with those sectors more successfully than we're doing now. And then we have to demonstrate change. We can't just talk about it, we can't just write about it. We've got to get our hands dirty, roll up our sleeves, get on the ground, figure it out. What do wildlife issues have to do with health? What do they have to do with a community whose public health worker says the number one issue we have here are venomous snake bites? What is the answer? Environmentalists need to be able to step up and demonstrate how you can make those changes. If we're rebuilding livelihoods that are based on natural resources, fisheries, if those communities were on a downward trajectory in terms of fisheries before the event, why would we set them up for that same downward decline afterwards? We can use better management practices to understand what the resource base is and adjust our programs and our activities appropriately. And so I looked at where do we go to get this kind of integrated training. And as you'll see here, there's a number of programs that are out there, and only when you stop there for a moment. So the numbers decrease in terms of where you find an integrated approach. There's a few that I found that address some environmental components in emergency management training, but by and large, they're very discipline and sector specific. Okay, next slide. And exactly zero that I could find that integrate humanitarian conflict and humanitarian action in one program, be it an academic program or a professional program. In my view, that's got to change in the future. And so this brings me back to Boudica and what Boudica did in this situation. He went in and he connected with that community. He didn't talk about the environment. He didn't talk about the Red Cross. He didn't talk about their trash. What he talked about is who they are as people, where they come from, what are their traditions, what are their cultures, what practices did they have in the past that could have a solution on today's problems. When the women said their number one concern was the nutrition of their children, he worked with them to bring back kitchen gardens. When I went to see this community 6 months after he got there, every household had a kitchen garden. When you're doing kitchen gardening, you need compost. If you want to make compost, you have to separate your trash. When you separate your trash, you start looking at your trash a little bit differently than you did before. And again, when we went back 6 months later, the women said to me, our husbands laughed at us when we started this, but then when they saw we were actually making a little bit of money off of our kitchen gardeners, they got up early and they got in the garden and started digging as well. The kids had better nutrition. They went back to wrapping their husband's lunch in banana leaves instead of plastic. There wasn't a stick of plastic to be seen in that community. There were local signs up that said, this is a no trash community. And so by going at this problem from a different standpoint, by getting out of our academic training and our disciplines, we were able to connect with the people, and we were able to connect their health, their trash, their economic development with one intervention, with one person who is creative and passionate. And that's what gives me hope for the future, and that we'll be able to bring this type of intervention to scale. So, recommendations. Again, we got to understand these aren't just technical challenges. It's more about the mindset and about thinking in an integrated fashion. Secondly, we have to learn to manage for change. And this is particularly true in the world that we live in now, given that, as I said, climate change changes everything. So we have to all take responsibility for adapting, both from a mitigation and a climate change adaptation point of view. And then thirdly, providing incentives. Anna mentioned incentives this morning. Small things we can do when we recruit our staff, when we recruit our volunteers. Can we try to encourage and look favorably on those who have a multidisciplinary approach, but most importantly, do they have the aptitude and the mindset for working in that way? And with that, I thank you.
Thanks, Anita. I thank you for showing us for some practical examples of how it can be done. It can be done, first of all, and how we can do it. Our next speaker, Sarah Costa, will also demonstrate how it's important, not just for conservationists and humanitarians, but also for other affected populations that we seek to reach, the most vulnerable. Sarah Costa is Executive Director of the Women's Refugee Commission. She has worked for more than 25 years in the fields of women's rights, reproductive health, gender and youth development, and global philanthropy. Before joining the Women's Refugee Commission, Sarah was Regional Director of the Global Fund for Women, a grant-making organization that supports women's rights organizations working on economic security, health, education, and leadership. She established the organization's New York office and represented the office in programmatic and fundraising activities on the East Coast. Before that, she was with the Ford Foundation in Brazil. She's worked many years for women's rights in Brazil, very active in the National Council on Women's Rights, and served on the boards of women's organizations in the women's health to the state government of Rio de Janeiro. So I hope you're supporting the Brazilian team. And she currently serves on the executive committee of the board of the Association of Women's Rights and Development and the advisory board of National Centers on Sexuality at the San Francisco State University, in addition to being the executive director of the Women's Refugee Commission. So I'll hand you the floor. Thank you, Sarah.